Hello and welcome to the Three Books from Hearts and Minds podcast. I'm Sam Levy with the CCO, Transforming College Students to Transform the World, and I'm here, as always, with Byron Borger from Hearts and Minds Books. Byron, how are you?
I'm good, Sam. Nice to be with you, and thanks to our listeners out there who are checking out the podcast. We're really, really grateful. This is fun.
It is a lot of fun. I always look forward to these times of getting to chat books with you, Byron. I'm looking forward in just a few weeks to getting to chat some books with you in person in Pittsburgh. We are in the countdown under a month, like about three weeks, 3.5 weeks away from the CCO's Jubilee Conference, which, Byron, you've had a huge part to play in throughout the history of the Jubilee Conference, and still play a big role there to sell books. Folks listening, if you're not familiar with Jubilee, we would love for you to join us in Pittsburgh. The website is simply jubileeconference.com, and you can check that out if you would like to learn more. It's a great chance to gather with a whole bunch of college students from around the country and others who are there to explore what does it mean to serve Jesus, to live out a Christian faith in every part of life. The same kinds of conversations and perspectives on thinking and living Christianly that we have here on the podcast in reference to books that help us do that. And Byron will be there.
What's even fun, Sam, you know this too, is that since we have these great speakers, famous authors and stuff in town to tell the biblical story and invite students into that, since we have these guys in Pittsburgh, they put together a day on Friday before the conference begins called Jubilee Professional for adults, for people in nonprofits or business world, business people in the work world, and pastors and clergy that want to share this vision of the lordship of Jesus over the work world and over all of life. It is a spectacular event. Last year was one of the best ever. And so CCO sort of partners with some activists in Pittsburgh to bring people together for Jubilee Pro, or J Pro, we sometimes call it. And there'll be engineers and scholars and politicians and artists and all sorts of people talking about faith and work in the trades, even for Jubilee Pro in the afternoon. And then if you sign up for that, you can stay and get into the conference for free. So it's a great event at J Pro and then the Jubilee weekend. And we take so many books out there, about 160 some categories, that it becomes, in the big space there at the convention center, probably the largest Christian bookstore certainly in Western Pennsylvania for those days, because we have so much of our store transported there. And so people come from out of town that are in the area that aren't even at the conference. They just come to shop at our store. So if you listen to the podcast and you like anything you hear, we'll have these kind of books right there at the convention center. And certainly you should come for J Pro or Jubilee Conference. But even if you can't do that, swing by and say hi to Hearts and Minds. We'd love that.
Absolutely. Looking forward to it. And it's fitting to start this episode talking a little about Jubilee, not just because the conference itself is coming up, but also because it was at Jubilee, really, for me, that I first encountered this idea that it was from you, Byron, talking about reading the Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other. Maybe more 2025 equivalent of that is, smartphone, news feed, social media in the other hand. But being aware of what's going on in the world, being part of those conversations and engaging them with the lordship of Jesus and with the Christian worldview in mind. What does the gospel have to say to the issues that matter to the people around us, so that we can love God and love our neighbors in a way that's not just sort of an out there kind of thing, but in the very real contexts of life in the world. And I believe we're going to talk about one such issue that is really important, and certainly in the United States right now.
Yeah, you set us up perfectly there, Sam. We're going to talk about 3 books about immigration. It's been in the news. Some of us have been involved in caring for migrants and refugees for decades and decades and decades. I have on and off in my life. My mom sort of adopted a Vietnamese refugee family back in the 70s, early 70s, late 60s, the early 70s. We called them boat people sometimes. They were leaving Vietnam when Vietnam fell and America pulled out. And there were just tons and tons and tons of Vietnamese people that were immigrants into central Pennsylvania. My sister-in-law volunteered to play with them at Fort Indiantown Gap, as I did. Didn't know her in those years, but we might have actually played with the same kids. But my mom, a conservative Republican family and a conservative church, adopted these refugees and became lifelong friends. And so I learned early on about caring for refugees, about world hunger concerns and how that causes refugee status. So anyway, I've been involved in refugee stuff for a while, certainly immigrant stuff for a while, on and off. I could tell you more about that in a minute. But I got 3 books that are just interesting for any of us, regardless of your policy perspectives on this, to make sure we have a compassionate and godly perspective, showing mercy to the refugees, as the Bible says we must. So how you handle borders and stuff, it's complicated, but I got 3 books to at least get us started to care well about this topic.
Great. Let's dive right in.
Okay, the first one is a fascinating book, and I don't even have a cover here to show you. I should be holding it up, but I'm out of it right now. But I got to tell you about it. It's a bit of a long story. I'll try to be quick. But the book is called The Snakehead. A snakehead in China is people that have often very poor ships to get people out of the country, often illegally. And Canadian in Chinese parlance, it's an illegal thing to escape. And so what you might want to call coyotes, as they bring people south from the Mexican border, snakeheads are what they're called in China. And this is an epic tale of the Chinese underground, the Chinese mafia in New York, who funds ships to get people out of China. A very, very important case in the 1980s, developed into the 2000s, that I was very deeply involved with. So, spoiler alert, I'm mentioned in this book. Good friends of mine in New York are described in great detail. The book is about this story that some of you have heard about, but it's sort of complicated. But it starts when Bill Clinton became the president of the United States. The first thing he did on day one is to make the forced abortion policy, one-child-only policy and forced abortion in China, no longer grounds for political asylum in the United States. It was grounds for asylum under the Reagan administration. When Clinton became president, he took that away. Well, people hired snakeheads to smuggle them out of the country because mostly they were Catholic or Buddhist, and they didn't want to have forced abortions. And so out of their desire to flee this terrible human rights problem, they snuck on these ships, came across the United States. They crashed in Africa. They eventually come across. It took them almost a year. And so this happened when they heard that you could get asylum in the United States if you're fleeing the one-child-only policy. And this ship full of folks, the ship was called the Golden Venture, crashed under the site of the Statue of Liberty, ironically, and they were washed ashore. Many people drowned in that terrible night. And 150, 60, 70, about 370 other folks that lived were in the middle of the night brought to a little landlocked town that had no immigration lawyers. We later found out this was on purpose, to a landlocked town that had some room in a prison called York, Pennsylvania, our next door town. And so they were brought to York, these Chinese refugees, thinking they could get asylum. And they stayed in prison in York for about a decade. A group of us began to protest this because we were pro-life, some of us. We were human rights activists, some of us. Some of us were liberal, some of us were conservative, but we realized that the Chinese in York were not getting a fair trial. They were not using the right Mandarin language. We had a guy that had been in prison under the Maoist regime in China that got asylum here, who was in our community. He was doing translating. And we finally began to realize that the lawyers for the government were told by the White House to get these immigrants the hell out of the country. That's a quote unquote from Al Gore, we later found out. Freedom of Information Act, we sued the government. It had a political protest where I preached the gospel every single week for about 10 years. It became the largest pro bono case in the history of American law. And Patrick Radden Keefe, who wrote this book, New York journalist, wanted to understand what was going on here. He writes for the New Yorker, for the Atlantic. He's been nominated for the American Book Award, all sorts of things. A heck of a great writer, a great investigative journalist. This was one of his early books. He came to York, spent time with us, and the book is laid out like this. The first third of it is basically the journey out of China, why some people want to escape the political repression in their countries, in this case, the forced abortion and one child only status, what it's like to smuggle out, and this rip roaring read of a book that is just frightening about this terrible ship that they got on crashing in Africa. Some of them actually stayed in Africa. One started a restaurant there and is thriving on the west coast of Africa, or the east coast of Africa. They eventually come around to South Africa. They come back across the Atlantic Ocean and they crash in New York. That's the first third of the book. The second third of the book is trying to figure out who legally or illegally is taking money to smuggle people out. And it becomes a story of the very dangerous Chinese mafia in the underground of Chinatown. And so then there's this whole exploration of who this woman is. Parenthetically, Patrick writes about this a little bit in the book, but as we were doing our protests week after week after week and having pro bono lawyers all over the country trying to get these guys and save their lives, when we'd lose a case, we know they'd go back to communist China and they would probably be killed. So we felt like it was Schindler's List or something. We were literally trying to save these guys' lives. The women they put down in a prison in New Orleans where they were sexually abused, by the way. And so we were scoping this whole thing out, and we decided we wanted to find out who this woman was that they paid the money to get the boats out of China, because they all owed her money. Pretty creepy. A couple of us went to New York City to try to track her down in some Chinese restaurants. We got a call from the FBI telling us, you should not be messing around with these people. You don't know who you're getting involved with. They are really dangerous. And for your own safety, you should stay the heck out of this. The FBI were literally following us as they were investigating this Madam Ping, who ran the Snakehead cartel in New York City. So the middle part of the book is about her. The third part of the book is about the Christians and others in New York who had this faithful response of trying to get people out of jail so we could get them asylum, and we pushed for what we called detention reform, the laws in the books about how long you can and cannot hold people that are seeking political asylum. Of course, political asylum is a legitimate thing all around the world where people that are fleeing one country can legally ask for safety in another country. And the asylum process, of course, you have to have hearings and make sure they're telling the truth. Are they really persecuted for religion or political reasons or not? It doesn't mean you can just sneak across the border and declare asylum because you want to. You have to have hearings and prove that you're at threat and that you're therefore offered hospitality in terms of international law that's rooted in the biblical tradition of the sanctuary cities of the Old Testament. So asylum law is something we began to learn about. As I had said, there were no immigration lawyers in New York at all. So none of the pro bono lawyers knew what we were doing. Heroic lawyers, conservative and liberal politically, Christian and otherwise. Some people came to the protests because they had been missionaries in China and they loved the Chinese people. Others were pro-life activists and they were concerned particularly about the one-child-only policy. Others were human rights activists like Amnesty International and stuff. I got involved and preached the gospel. Documentaries have been made about this, but the best way into this story is The Snakehead by Patrick Radden Keefe. It is one of the best books I've ever read. The third portion is about our Christian ministry run by a United Methodist pastor and myself and a whole bunch of other great folks in the city of York. And Patrick came. We did a book launch when the book came out here in York, and it was one of the most unforgettable moments of my life. In that whole escapade of trying to get asylum for the Chinese asylum seekers, they developed artwork that was indigenous to their culture that we began to sell all over the world, met famous movie stars and stuff that wanted in on it. Oprah got involved. We had people in the White House who were opposed to us. ICE was terrible in this Democrat policy. Clinton hated refugees. And so it was a mess. We were suing the government. We were preaching in the capital of Washington, D.C. We had guns aimed at us in York. It's quite a story. And I say all this to tell you that if you're interested at all in the immigration debate, why people leave their country, what it's like to make the journey, what local people can do to become advocates for people that are very unlike ourselves and whose experiences in life were so very different than our own, and how it transcends partisan politics. Now, this was 25 years ago, but for a decade, left, right, and center worked together, Christians and non-Christians worked together in this program that eventually was written about by Patrick Radden Keefe in The Snakehead, where we were advocates for these folks. So that's a short version of this complicated story of our work in working for Chinese immigrants to get asylum status in the United States. We had to get asylum law changed because, of course, as you might guess, the Clinton administration said that the forced abortion policies are no longer grounds for asylum. And here's why that is, just for anybody listening that might care about this. You see, we were at that point beginning to move into the globalization movement, and we were trying to help international trade. And insofar as we wanted to get trade deals with China, they needed to be named in the United Nations as most favored nation status. That's in the GATT agreements and stuff, in the trade agreements, that becomes sort of not a very sexy policy issue, but they needed to be declared most favored nation status. And we could then have better trade agreements with them. If you were a human rights abuser, you could not get most favored nation status. And so therefore, to say that they had a one-child only policy and would do forced cesareans on women without anesthesia, to say that they would do that would be a human rights abuse. So they had to cover up the human rights abuse in order to create economic trade so we could get cheap stuff cheap. It's interesting that in those very years, we were pressing Hillary Clinton, who was having a woman's feminist, egalitarian declaration in the United Nations, to include China, because her husband's policies to exclude China and declare that there weren't human rights abuses there was in fact harming women who were pregnant in that very country. And eventually Hillary came around on that, to be honest. She did a heroic move. But anyway, that's in this book as well. So it's complicated, policy is complicated, but human lives are at stake. And this tells the human story of Chinese immigrants and asylum hearings and asylum claims, and how that happens to deal with policy issues of what counts for asylum and what doesn't, and how people of faith and others can rise to the occasion in a small town like York, Pennsylvania. I think it's one of my all-time favorite books, and I really, really recommend it to people. Sorry, that was a lot.
That's okay. What a story. So that sounds like a great read if you're interested in immigration and some of the backstory, years before we got to where we are right now in 2025. And if you're if you're interested in learning more about the life that Byron Borger has led and the ways that you have lived out your faith in not just selling books, but getting involved in other ways as well.
A young man who is the son of one of our best friends happened to be reading this just because he reads widely and he likes Patrick Radden Keefe a lot as a writer. He's written some other books and essays. And so he was reading this, and 3/4 of the way through, he's like, oh my goodness, my friend Byron is in this book. And I got this email. It's like, I'm reading about you, man. I didn't even know. He just picked it up because he thought it sounded interesting. So, well, let me tell you about another book that is in a certain way kind of similar. You might catch my drift of what I'm doing here is to capture the complexity of the journey into a free country and the painful, compassionate pathos that's full of that. Doesn't answer the policy questions right away about borders and so forth. But to get a sense of what we're talking about as we debate policies, we at least have to understand what immigrants are going through. The Chinese immigrants seeking asylum in the Snakehead is one picture. Here's another picture. It is a book called Enrique's Journey. The woman that wrote it is Sonia Nazario. She's won a Pulitzer Prize. She's a great, great writer and investigative journalist. I've led book clubs on this on 2 different occasions, and everybody loves it that reads this. You can hardly believe it. This is a book about a boy named Enrique who is in Central America and gets on the roof of a train, as many kids do, to try to make their way into the United States. Some people call it the death train because it is so very dangerous. But it is a way some of these folks have been able, now this is years ago, able to get into the United States by riding on this death train. This is a searing, searing book, an unforgettable book from the immigration front lines, I would say. Harrowing, heartbreaking story, but yet you grow to really like this kid. As with many immigrants, you end up getting on this train. If you fall off, you could lose your legs. It's really dangerous. Hopping trains is dangerous business. More so, there are pirates or crooks riding on the trains that capture the kids, abuse the kids, steal whatever stuff they may have. It is a harrowing journey because of the criminals that can get you and because of the physical danger. And yet, Peasants all along the way in Central America and up through Mexico know that this is happening, and poor peasants along the train line put out food and stuff for them. It is a remarkable display of generous charity all along the way, even as they're often terribly attacked. What often happens then, as they get 3/4 of the way, it's taken months in starvation and struggle, and they end up half the way up into Mexico, and they get caught by the government forces and they're sent home. And of course, if they have their reasons, they want to try again. And they may make the journey a second or third time. Enrique is accompanied by this New York journalist, Pulitzer Prize winning, living in a fancy apartment, probably in the Upper East Side. And she decides to go into Central America. She speaks Spanish. Go into Central America, get on this train, and go with the kid. One can hardly believe that any journalist in the United States would be so brave as to put herself in danger and poverty and struggle for months at a time to be with Enrique as she tells the story of this boy's very dangerous odyssey, to be reunited with his mother, who had to leave to get a job. He's trying to find his mother, thinks he'll just come to America and find her. Little does he know that she's not even in Texas or anywhere near, that he's going to have to go through another journey to find where she is and get to her. And that is part of the last third of the book, is his journey in the United States to get to where his mother lives. I had said that the author lives in New York, and I'm mistaken about that. She lived in Los Angeles. But again, a middle-class professional reporter that joins Enrique on this journey and becomes an advocate for him, facing everything from poverty to corrupt cops to all the rest. And one reviewer described it as a 21st century odyssey, like the great Greek play. It's really a memorable story, a classic of immigration literature. And if anybody, again, wants to know what drives immigrants, what they have to go through, what it feels like to be in those shoes, and even to then get into the United States and still not know what to do. These days, it would be a little different because there's so many border guards and so forth. But Enrique's journey is a magnificent read. I couldn't put it down. I've led book clubs on it. It really is a neat book, and it'll give you at least an insight, if not compassion, for some of the kids that have made this journey to get reunited with their families, who, because of economic pressures and other dangers, have felt like they needed to leave the war-torn areas where they are in Honduras or Guatemala or El Salvador. So, yeah, Enrique's journey. What a book.
Another one that sounds like a captivating read, along with the Snakehead, a great story. I think it's so common when things become an issue, especially when they get caught up in our partisan divides. It's so easy to dehumanize the people that are involved in that issue, right? And books like this that tell the story of, it's the story of one person, but it's more than that, I think. It humanizes not just Enrique, but everyone in that situation or similar situations, and helps us to think about these things not just as an issue, but as something that affects people.
And parenthetically, we could say this too, Sam. Good literature can do that as well. I mean,
it sure does.
The Grapes of Wrath or something, by Steinbeck. Those kind of stories can humanize someone, but in the particularity of that, you see the bigger picture and you understand what's really going on. Now, that doesn't answer the tough questions about legality and Christian principles and social justice in the Bible, what the Bible says when it says to let immigrants live wherever they want, and God will bless your land if you do that. Like, I don't know what you make of all of that. I just did a book notes, our weekly newsletter, on books about immigration, have about 25 books listed and annotated, some of them that are very theological, some that are Bible studies, some that are partisan arguments, some by immigrants themselves. One of them, the contract for writing the book, was signed in our very store. So people might want to check out, if they want the biblical and theological basis, by looking at our book notes newsletter. But this Enrique's journey and the Snakehead really do humanize the situation, and that's why I wanted to start with those. Here's the third one I'll mention, and I'll mention it quickly, but it's a fascinating story. It's a woman named Bree Stensrud, Stensrud, and the book is called Start with Welcome. And her start with welcome is a biblical and theological, if basic, invitation to be welcoming, to show hospitality, to show compassion and care to the stranger in our midst, as the Bible so often says, what you do to the least of these, She does have some studies about borders and about immigrants in the Bible. So there is some pretty good biblical theological stuff here. But it's not a whole heavy treatise. It's more a practical guide to what ordinary people can do and what it means to offer welcome. The subtitle is A Journey Towards a Confident and Compassionate Immigration Conversation. We can have a conversation that is decent and we can disagree about things, but we all have to agree that mercy and compassion is part of the story, and that we have to have confidence in saying, this is what Jesus would want, and this is what the Bible says. What that looks like and how we debate that is one thing, but we do it with compassion. Here's the interesting thing about this book, and I list this particularly because in our communities, let's face it, more mainline denominational folks are advocates for immigrants. All of the mainline denominations and Catholic churches have done that. Some evangelicals are as well. But there's a certain constituency of conservative evangelicals who are often anti-abortion, by the way, who are a little conservative, if you will, or worried about immigration, and they line up more favorably with the Trump policy. She is one of those kind of people. She's an active pro-life activist, and along with Focus on the Family, which is a conservative Christian political organization on the right that advocates for pro-life causes, she's worked with Focus on the Family and with Russell Moore and some others to be women pro-lifers who want pro-life values to care for the oppressed and the unborn, to filter out into how we treat once people are born, a more holistic, consistent life ethic. Now, she doesn't deal with all of the life ethic issues of war and the death penalty and so forth, but she does try to connect the pro-life movement and focusing on the family to what it means to have pro-family immigration policies and what it means to welcome children. And so with other women, she started a movement of pro-life women who are fairly conservative theologically to follow their hearts, to show compassion also to immigrants. This is biblical orthodoxy and a wild sort of sense of a holistic, consistent worldview. I so value this kind of perspective that wants to be consistent, that wants to show love to everybody, that thinks love really is the answer, that as complex as some political positions may be, we start with welcome, we start with care. Sharon Hodey Miller, who wrote a book about reaching out across cultural boundaries and reaching out cross-culturally to people, she says, if you're curious what scriptures teach about how to care for the immigrant and the refugee in an incredibly complex world, there is no better place to start than this book. I decided years ago, as a pro-life activist and Focus on the Family friend, to not limit her pro-life concerns to only the unborn, but to expand the umbrella a little bit more and wonder what it would look like to be consistent with that kind of a life ethic. And so she reaches out to people on the fairly conservative evangelical end theologically and conservative politically, perhaps, and invites them into a conversation that would take those very principles and allow us to start with a sense of welcome and hospitality. There are heavier books out there. There's more politically rigorous and more theologically rigorous books out there, but this is really one to start with. I think this is a gem. Start with welcome, the journey towards a confident and compassionate immigration conversation. So I think that's a great one to start. If you want more, you can look at our website, but this is a good one to get going on, and it'll help shape us as we show a consistent way of showing God's love and justice to everybody, particularly the most vulnerable.
That's fantastic. Lots to chew on as we live out our call to wrestle with these things, to think deeply, to listen to other voices, and to figure out what is our faith in Christ ask of us in our time and place, given what we see happening in our midst. So thank you, Byron, and thank you all for listening. If you want to place an order for any of these books or more, the first link in the episode description will take you where you need to go to order from Hearts and Minds. We'd love for you to like and share this podcast and reach out. We'd love to chat with you. Contact me or Byron or both of us and read these books and share what you think in the comments here or in an email to us. So for Byron, Hearts and Minds Books, and the CCO, this has been another episode of the 3 Books from Hearts and Minds podcast. Have a great day.